This was not the only LSD-related banking taking place at Castle. Accounts were also maintained by William Mellon Hitchcock, a scion of the Mellon family, who will appear again in connection with the UK's Profumo affair in Chapter 4. Hitchcock was one of the financial backers of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, the so-called hippie mafia that produced and distributed psychedelics on an international scale. Given that they were based in Orange County, California, it is possible that Palmer's ring was part of their operation, though that cannot be confirmed at this time. The San Francisco IRS requested aid from the IRS intelligence apparatus in Chicago, which promptly tracked down Castle's information. They found a card that listed the bank's principals, several of whom were revealed to have been fictitious characters. At the top of the list was Cantor and his partner, the other half of Castle's management, Paul Halliwell. Alan Block writes that Cantor and Halliwell had known each other since the late 1950s, having met while working on a deal between a Cantor client and one of Halliwell's. Castle Bank was a melding of worlds. On the one hand, there was Cantor's specialty in offshore trusts and his connections to both the city's political power centers and the sprawl of its supermob. On the other hand, there was Halliwell, the Republican Party insider, intelligence veteran and continued intelligence asset, and an offshore specialist in his own right, with intimate connections to the blossoming heroin traffic coming out from Southeast Asia. Together, they organized a complicated money laundering operation that silently moved the funds of powerful gangsters, politicians, businessmen, and intelligence services around the globe. When Castle was first established, it was just a paper company, a company that existed only as a legal entity with no offices, infrastructure, or business activity to speak of. It sat for 3 years from when it was registered in 1964 until 1967, when it was finally activated. A physical headquarters was established in Nassau, and a law firm, that of a British expert living in Argentina, named Anthony James Tallis Gooding, was retained. Shortly thereafter, the number of accounts at the bank began to balloon. Banking relations were then established with banks in the United States, namely Bank of Perrin and Bank of Cutler Ridge. Bank of Perrin and Bank of Cutler Ridge were small, Florida-based institutions that were intimately interconnected. They shared relationships not only with Castle Bank, but with one another as well. Both had the same chairman, Paul Halliwell, and they were also owned by the same sets of holding companies, HMT Corporation and later Florida Shares Inc. The shares of these companies were owned by Halliwell and his circle of associates, with one being a mysterious figure by the name of E.P. Barry. Halliwell and Barry had known each other since their days together in the OSS, though the details of the particulars of their relationships are murky. Barry had spent time in the Middle East during his clandestine service, but by the end of the war he was serving as the head of OSS X2 Vienna branch, i.e. the OSS Counterintelligence Division. Following the war, Barry remained in Europe and became immersed in the world of Zurich banking. Through Barry and his connection to Halliwell and HMT Florida shares, a number of connections can be found. As will be discussed in Chapter 3, Barry, at the same time that he was involved with these Florida banks, could also be found at the ground floor of Intermaritime Bank, which was controlled by a close friend of future CIA Director William J. Casey and a businessman underworld operator named Bruce Rappaport. Casey, also an OSS veteran, was reportedly close to Barry as well. Another bank discussed in later chapters is the Bank of World Commerce, a Lansky-controlled bank that helped move casino skim and other hot money funds abroad. According to Tom Farrer, Bank of Perrin had banking relations with the Bank of World Commerce in addition to Castle Bank and Trust. What was taking shape, in other words, appears to have been an elaborate daisy chain of offshore banks. One of the early ventures that Castle engaged in was a convoluted land fraud that netted millions and intimately involved Cantor. The fraud was carried out under the auspices of a company called International Computerized Land Research, ICLR. Gooding, the British Argentine attorney who represented Castle, registered the company, and Cantor appears to have kept the company afloat financially in addition to it using the services of Castle Bank. Thanks to the Bahamas Bank secrecy structures, Cantor was able to obscure his position as hidden partner in ICLR. ICLR was run by James McGowan and James Ferreira, the latter of whom was a fairly sleazy operator with a criminal record stretching back to 1926, when he was fined for running a whorehouse. He spent some time in prison in the 1930s and 1940s for violations of the Mann Act, having to do with transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. ICLR was just one, albeit the largest and most complex in a string of companies this pair had formed in order to hawk low-value California land at high price to unsuspecting investors in Europe and Asia. The promotional material reads, one press report, lists Nassau, Okinawa, Hong Kong, Zurich, and Munich as sites of real estate agencies representing ICLR. Like Cantor's elaborate kickback schemes on behalf of the Pritzkers, authorities took decades to untangle the web left by ICLR. When indictments were finally brought against McGowan and Ferreira in 1982, the Los Angeles Times reported that the duo stood accused of running a far-flung land sales empire that defrauded buyers of more than $15 million over a 17-year period. The $15 million is a very conservative number, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Gary Fees. Given that Cantor and his associates effectively structured ICLR, provided it with financing, took a financial stake in the company, and provided it with banking services, there are obvious questions as to the ultimate purpose and destination of this pilfered money. Castle Bank wasn't only a repository and conduit for money belonging to tax-evading billionaires, shady businessmen, drug dealers, and land fraudsters. It seems some of their other clients wielded a different kind of power that helped grant the bank its knack for evading official inquiry. First, sweeping IRS probe into Castle that had unearthed an expansive network dedicated to tax evasion was shut down. In addition, the list of names of Castle clients investigators had obtained was declared to have been found through illegal means. Then, a Department of Justice probe into the bank was dropped in 1977. 3 years later, in 1980, the real circumstances of this obstruction were revealed. Quote, "It now appears that pressure from the Central Intelligence Agency, rather than any legal problem, was what caused the Justice Department to drop what could have been the biggest tax evasion case of all time. Moreover, the supposed legal obstacle to using the Castle Bank depositors lists was questionable at best. The government already had in its possession the same list legally obtained. What caused the Justice Department to back off seems to have been the CIA's argument that pursuit of the Castle Bank would endanger national security." Quote end. According to an unnamed federal source, Castle Bank was one of the CIA's finance channels for operations against Cuba. Halliwell, and presumably Castle, was purportedly involved with the agency in financing a series of covert forays between 1964 and 1975 against Cuba by CIA operatives working from Andros Island, one of the many islands located in the Bahamas not too far from Florida's southernmost coastline. Declassified CIA files show that, going back to the pre-Bay of Pigs invasion area, Andros was used as a staging ground for the CIA's cadres of Cuban exiles that the agency had armed and trained to fight against Castro. Later, in the 1980s, Andros would serve as one of the transshipment points for Colombian cocaine flowing into the United States by way of Nicaragua. Involved in this particular channel was a figure who will be addressed at length in future chapters, Robert Vasco. Chapter 2. Booze and Blackmail. The Whiskey Man. Per his own account, Samuel Bronfman had never planned to become one of North America's top liquor magnates, having previously aspired to a career in law. Nevertheless, true to his family's last name, which means whiskey man in Yiddish, he and his brothers went on to build a liquor empire that would rocket the Bronfmans into the upper echelons of the Western business elite. Through the road they travelled to get there was hardly elegant. While the Bronfmans are now remembered as scions of Canada's upper class, this was certainly not the case when Samuel's parents, Mindel and Yakiel Bronfman, brought the family to Canada from Bessarabia, now part of modern-day Moldova, and Ukraine in 1889. They had left as part of a wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing the anti-Semitic pogroms of Tsarist Russia. Whatever, the Tsaren in German, the Tsarist Russia, leaving behind a somewhat profitable tobacco farming business. In Bessarabia, they had been relatively well off and had emigrated to Canada along with two of their servants and their personal rabbi. However, Canada, particularly Manitoba, where the Bronfmans eventually settled, was poorly suited for tobacco farming, forcing Yakiel to labor on Canadian railroads and in sawmills before moving into the sale of firewood and the trading of livestock and fish. It would be their trading of horses that would eventually lead them to begin work in the hospitality sector and, subsequently, the liquor business. The Bronfmans' beginnings, particularly following their arrival in Canada, stand in such stark contrast to their current reputation that even Sam's son, Edgar and Charles, were kept in the dark by their own father regarding the family business early days. He would never tell us any of the early history Edgar Bronfman would later remember of his father. A Bronfman biographer, former senior editor at The Economist, Nicholas Faith, would also write that underlying the family's riches was a deep sense of shame as to their origins, and that Sam's generation had shared an absolute refusal to tell their offspring anything about their life before their arrival in the Promised Land, i.e. Canada. Part of the reason for this secrecy, even within the family and between father and son, was likely related to the personal struggle of many immigrants, some of whom choose to turn their back on their lives prior to immigrating and strive to establish and prove their connections to the new land in which they find themselves. Indeed, Sam Bronfman went to great lengths to do just that, publicly claiming for much of his late life that he had been born on March 4th, 1891, in Brandon, Manitoba, Canada, obfuscating both his real date and place of birth, February 27th, 1889, Bessarabia. Michael Merris, one of Bronfman's more sympathetic biographers, would write that Sam Bronfman never truly abandoned his enthusiastic identification with the country in which his career began, and his attempts to obfuscate his place of birth is perhaps the most significant indication of his obsession with the respectability he associated with Canadian citizenship. While Sam Bronfman was undoubtedly ill at ease with his status as an immigrant, there is another factor that may explain his unwillingness, and that of his 7 siblings, to discuss the family's early days, and specifically the chain of events and eventual alliances with unsavory characters that would lead them to the top of Canada's business elite. At some point, in the early 1890s, as he sampled spirits in a dingy saloon. After selling off some horses, Jekyll Bronfman mulled the merits of leaving behind a life of hard labor in favor of the intertwined businesses and of hospitality and liquor sales. Sam Bronfman would later claim that it was actually he who had convinced his father to move into hospitality and bartending, though most biographers doubt this, given Sam's age at the time. Regardless, it would be over a decade before the Bronfman family patriarch and his eldest sons managed to scrape together the funds necessary to realize Jekyll's dreams. The Bronfmans had saved enough money to lease their first Canadian hotel, the Anglo-American Hotel in Emerson, Manitoba, by 1903. Soon they acquired several more hotels in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and later in Winnipeg, and beyond, building a small yet profitable network of hotels prior to the onset of World War I. The dramatic shift in the family's fortune was largely thanks to the business acumen of Sam's brother Harry, who managed to stave off the financial damage and legal trouble caused by the gambling and other unseemly habits of their older brother Abe. Sam Bronfman formally joined the new family business in 1907, though he would later regale some of his biographers with tales of how he had been the original dynamo behind the family's success in hospitality, despite considerable evidence to the contrary. What is notable, however, is the fact that not long after Sam formally became involved in hotel management, the family's hotels were targeted by a series of unfortunate accusations, including when they went to renew the liquor license in Yorktown in 1908. Locals had alleged that the Bronfmans were guilty of violating local liquor laws and condoning illegal gamblings in their inns. Well, the latter is particularly likely given the well-known gambling habits of Abe Bronfman, which were known to have threatened the family business on more than one occasion. The same year that Sam joined the family's hotel business, the organization that would eventually bring prohibition to Canada also emerged, the Social and Moral Reform Council. A joining of the leadership of various Protestant churches, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Royal Templars of Temperance, and other like-minded groups, the Social and Moral Reform Council was born out of a far-reaching Protestant religious movement of the period known as the Social Gospel Movement that sought to fight social evils, particularly those caused or exacerbated by rapid urbanization and industrialization. For groups like the Social and Moral Reform Council, liquor quickly became a main target. The council and its allies managed to successfully appeal to many Canadians, both those who shared and lacked their religious zeal, as bars and saloons were often disliked for other reasons aside from their moral depravity, such as their often far-reaching stenches and the fact that around a third of criminal prosecutions at the time were related to drunkenness. Excuse me. Though the temperance movement in Canada deeply divided its population, it got the boost it needed to become common policy with the onset of the First World War. In Canada, prohibition was initially a provincial matter, with a handful of provinces having enacted prohibition laws prior to the war. Yet, once the curtain of war had fallen, many Canadians came to believe that banning the sale, trade, and manufacture of alcohol would aid the war effort. As a result, most Canadian provinces enacted some sort of alcohol ban prior to Canada's short-lived federal ban, enacted near the end of the war in 1918 and expiring a year after hostilities ended. The impact of prohibition on Canada's liquor industry was substantial and felt long after it was repealed, with 75% of its breweries having closed by 1928. However, prohibition was conveniently fortuitous for some, the Bronfmans chief among them. Given the provincial nature of prohibition in Canada prior to its brief stint as a federal policy, the differences between the temperance laws of various provinces provided numerous loopholes that the Bronfmans were able to exploit to great effect. So successful were the Bronfmans at aptly working in the grey area of the varied and often temporary gaps between provincial laws that author Peter Newman remarked in his biography of the Bronfmans dynasty, the Rothschilds of the New World. Quote, sometimes it almost seemed that the American Congress and the Canadian federal and provincial legislators must have secretly held a grand conclave to decide on one issue: how they could draft anti-liquor laws and regulations that would help maximize the Bronfman brothers' bootlegging profits. Quote end. In one example, during World War I, the three eldest Bronfman brothers, Abe, Harry, and Sam, exploited the fact that Manitoba and Ontario, while prohibiting the sale of liquor within the province, allowed alcohol to be imported. The brothers set up several mail-order liquor business throughout these two provinces and profited handsomely, that is, until the ban of interprovincial trading would go into effect in 1918 with federal prohibition. However, federal prohibition also came with a loophole, which allowed alcohol to be sold for medicinal purposes. This prompted Harry Bronfman to create a wholesale drug company that permitted him to import alcohol in bulk and provide it to area pharmacies. He placed its offices next door to one of the family's Ritzier hotels, the Balmoral, and its business model involved offering doctors a bonus for each liquor prescription they wrote if that prescription was fulfilled by a pharmacy whose liquor was furnished by the Bronfmans. A Canadian writer, Mordecai Richler, would later allege that the initial license for Harry's new enterprise, named the Canada Pure Drug Company, was acquired by a well-placed bribe to a prominent politician. Other family biographers, like Michael Maris, called the firm a thinly disguised liquor outlet that soon pumped more whiskey into retail drugstores than any other wholesaler in Saskatchewan. Strange names in Canada. Well, the company also benefited from the corruption of the province's liquor commission, which allowed a percentage of the liquor it seized, to be sold back to Harry Bronfman, who then resold it at an exorbitantly marked up price. Subsequent government investigations that were part of a royal commission would further allege that the Bronfman family drug company was never engaged in the drug business, but confined its activities to the sale of alcohol in the western provinces, adding that the company imported hundreds of thousands of gallons of alcohol from the United States. Out of the Bronfman brothers, it had been Sam who was sent to travel across Canada and the United States, which allowed him to build a vast network that included numerous American and Canadian distilleries and bootleggers. This network would, in a few years, prove essential to the Bronfmans, especially Sam, once Prohibition arrived in Canada's southern neighbor, the United States. The many friends of Mr. Sam. Beyond the complicity of corrupt officials and doctors, a driving force behind the Bronfman family's Prohibition-era success was their ties, forged by Sam, to the Hudson Bay Company, long a dominant force in Canada's economy, backed by the political and economic elite of England since its founding in the 1600s. According to Nicholas Faith, Hudson's Bay Company trusted him, so Sam, implicitly after he had refused to make any profit on a couple of thousand cases of Dewar's whiskey that Hudson Bay wanted to buy back from him. However, in the cutthroat and often extremely violent world of bootlegging in Canada, implicit trust was unlikely to have been granted from just a single act. More likely was the fact that Hudson's Bay Company had long been the dominant force in Canada's liquor industry and had every intention of continuing to operate its liquor business during Prohibition. The Bronfmans were sure to have caught their attention early on, not just through their mail order business, but because Harry Bronfman had quickly gained a reputation as the king of bootleggers, who was able to easily skirt the law due to his contacts with corrupt local and provincial officials. His brother Sam sought to focus the entire family business on liquor early on in Prohibition, which would have made him a critical contact for any business seeking to clandestinely deal with the Bronfman's sale of spirits during this period. The Hudson Bay Company's import of liquor into Canada by various means during Prohibition greatly aided the business of several distillers in England and Scotland. Many of those British distillers boasted close ties to the royal family and England's political elite, like the Wars. These companies risked losing a considerable amount of income if their ability to export spirits to Canada had been entirely cut off, especially at a time when drinking in England was on the wane. The British government itself was clearly aware of these concerns and made the promotion of exports, liquor in particular, a key policy aimed at offsetting the country's considerable war debts. Direct ties of the company to bootlegging in Canada emerged when British Columbia's Prohibition Commissioner, Walter Findlay, was caught engaging in and profiting from the illegal liquor trade. At his trial, the existence of a liquor delivery service run by the Hudson's Bay Company that sent alcohol to private addresses and spanned the nation was revealed despite Findlay's refusal to testify. Whatever the real story was behind the ties that were forged between Sam Bronfman and the Hudson's Bay Company, the dominant distillers of England and Scotland that held great sway over the company's liquor subsidiary, would be critical to Bronfman's success during and after Prohibition, and he to theirs. Soon after the conclusion of Canadian Prohibition went into effect in the United States in January 1920. The Bronfmans, now largely under Sam's leadership, continued to import American liquor at incredible quantities, but at much cheaper rate given that the new law had made it essentially worthless in its country of origin. That imported liquor was then mixed with raw alcohol and water. This degradation allowed the Bronfmans to ship a much larger quantity of the liquor than they had purchased back into the United States. Such was the story of the Bronfman family's initial entry into the distilling business. As stock from American distilleries began to run out in 1923, the Bronfmans built a distillery near Montreal. They named their newest venture Distillers Corporation Limited, the same name as the then unrelated and significantly more prestigious Scottish company that included the top 5 whisky and gin producers in the British Isles. The name the Bronfmans had chosen was no coincidence, as the audacious name Sam had chosen for the family's first distillery succeeded in attracting the near immediate attention of the Scottish firm. The Bronfman family subsequently formed a joint venture with the elite of Scotland's and England's liquor industry, thereby uniting the two companies that shared the name Distillers Corporation Limited. Their union also allowed the Bronfmans to secure the exclusive rights to import many of the top brands from across the pond. Roughly a decade later, in the 1930s, Samuel Bronfman purchased and built a number of distilleries in Scotland, further deepening his ties to the liquor barons of the Old World. The ability of the Bronfmans to secure this deal at the time likely owed to Sam's pre-existing ties to the Hudson's Bay Company, which had previously imported many of the brands united under the British Distillers Company Limited. Another potential factor was the chance meeting between one of the Bronfman's middlemen, Louis Rosenstiel, and Winston Churchill in 1922. A year later, Bronfman traveled to Kentucky, where Rosenstiel was based at the time, and purchased an ailing distillery, the components of which were then shipped north and used to create the Bronfman's first distillery. Churchill had deep family and personal ties to the Hudson's Bay Company, and from 1919 to 1922 he was in charge of Britain's colonial office. In this capacity, Churchill refused to use British authority or influence to interfere with the liquor trade in any British colony, including in British-dominated Rumraw, where the Bronfmen were also active. Churchill argued that England was not obligated to enforce the laws of another nation and would later call prohibition as a policy an affront to the whole history of mankind. Churchill would later emerge as a key investor in America's post-prohibition liquor industry, which Bronfman and Rosenstiel would quickly come to dominate. As the Bronfman family's clout in the liquor industry grew after prohibition, Sam Bronfman would later manage to personally meet Queen Elizabeth II of England, and he would even create a Canadian whiskey, Crown Royal, to specifically commemorate her visit to Canada in 1939. 5 years after creating the successful joint venture with Distillers Company Limited, the Bronfman's Distillers Corporation Limited purchased Joseph E. Seagrams and Sons Limited and their distillery in Waterloo, Ontario. The merged company became Seagram Company Limited, or Seagrams, and would serve as the Bronfman family's financial vehicle, not just for their ever-expanding liquor empire, but their subsequent interests in chemicals, oil, and entertainment. Though his British and Scottish connections were important to his and Seagram's success, Sam Bronfman's rise as a global liquor baron also depended significantly on the ties he had forged, often through his middlemen, with more unsavory actors, namely key figures in North American organized crime. Many of them still live on in American urban legend and were discussed at length in the previous chapter, including Charles Lucky Luciano, Moe Dalitz, Abner Longy Zwillman, Meyer Lansky, and members of Detroit's Purple Gang, among others. Much of the Bronfman's early involvement in bootlegging took place across the Saskatchewan, North Dakota border in Boozoriums, where their liquor could be purchased in Canada and then moved to their final destination in the United States. Yet, the murder of a Bronfman brother-in-law turned associate, and the promise of more lucrative markets for Bronfman booze soon drew their attention elsewhere. Quote, "We were late starters in the two most lucrative markets on the high seas and across the Detroit River. What came out of the border trade in Saskatchewan was insignificant by comparison," quote, and Bronfman once told Canadian journalist Terence Robertson. Despite being late to the game, quote, "This was when we started to make our real money," Bronfman recounted. The bootlegging operation of the Bronfmans would later extend far beyond the Canadian-US border, with the family establishing warehouses and fronts throughout the Caribbean and Mexico. They were encircling their main market, the United States, like prey. Of course, with great profit came great risk, and though they avoided major legal trouble for their ties to bootlegging operations during American Prohibition, it caught up with them soon after. In 1934, the Bronfman brothers were charged with conspiracy to violate the statutes of a friendly country and for evading taxes on liquor that they had exported out of Canada. Soon after the charges were announced, Sam Bronfman allegedly ordered the destruction of thousands of documents aimed at shielding their early operations from inquisitorial eyes, and Bronfman owned companies tied to smuggling, and their assets would mysteriously vanish. As a result, the case against the Bronfmans ran into an insurmountable roadblock, and 4 Bronfman brothers were acquitted on all charges by the summer of 1935. They even managed to settle with U.S. authorities, negotiating a $3 million settlement with the Treasury Department, a mere fraction of what they had gained during American Prohibition. Most of Bronfman's mob associates during American Prohibition were members of, or somehow tied to, the National Crime Syndicate. This syndicate, described in detail in the previous chapter, was subsequently defined by the 1950 Senate investigative body, the Kefauver Committee, as a confederation of organized crime interests then dominated by the Italian-American Mafia and the Jewish-American mob. During the Kefauver Committee's investigation, some of the biggest players in the American Mafia named Bronfman as a central figure in their bootlegging operations. Though Sam was careful to distance himself as much as possible from prominent criminals, he did have a somewhat cozy relationship with Meyer Lansky, with Lansky's wife later recounting how Bronfman had thrown lavish dinner parties for her husband. The relationship appears to have begun in 1923, when Lansky bought Sam prize tickets to the boxing championship between Jack Dempsey and Louis Firpo in New York, likely a gesture aimed at gaining Sam's favor or perhaps returning one. Subsequently, Lansky would, among other things, offer exclusive protection of Bronfman's booze shipments. In his old age, Lansky, apparently bitter that Bronfman had managed to launder his post-prohibition reputation into that of an upstanding member of North American aristocracy, would remark, quote, "Why is Lansky a gangster and not the Bronfman and Rosenstiel families? I was involved with all of them in the 1920s, although they do not like to talk about it and change the subject when my name is mentioned." Quote end. The ties between the Bronfman family business and organized crime may explain why some past efforts to chronicle the rise of the Bronfmans were ill-fated, particularly during Sam Bronfman's lifetime. The first person who attempted to write a biography of Samuel Bronfman, Terence Robertson, had traveled to New York to investigate Bronfman and the then sprawling corporate empire of Seagrams. While in New York, he had allegedly concluded the book, but had telephoned the journalist colleague back in Canada, distraught. In that phone call, Robertson claimed to have found out things about Sam they didn't want me to write about. Robertson would call a second colleague, stressing that his life had been threatened and he would know who was doing the threatening, but he would do the job himself. After receiving the frantic call and fearing that Robertson's life was in danger, the second journalist called the New York police, who quickly responded, only to find Robertson dying of barbiturate poisoning, to which he succumbed. Robertson's lengthy interviews with Bronfman were never published, but still exist in manuscript form. Subsequent attempts to author a biography of Sam Bronfman and his family's rise to prominence also failed to make it to publication, such as the effort made by former editor of the Canadian edition of Time magazine, John Scott, and another made by Canadian journalist Erna Paris. However, some books on the Bronfman family did emerge once Sam had reached old age, such as an account of the family by Peter Newman, and a novel by Mordecai Richler believed to have been inspired by the Bronfmans. The Bronfmans apparently did not take kindly to their portrayal by either Newman or Richler, both of whom were Jewish, prompting the family behind Seagrams to allege that both authors were anti-Semitic Jews. The Bronfman clan has always been sensitive to critical reports, given that their long-standing efforts to develop their reputation as elite philanthropists are marred by the evidence of the symbiotic relationship between their family business and organized crime. The Middleman. Aside from these more personal ties, also crucial to the success of Seagram's and the Bronfman family enterprise during this period were an assortment of middlemen. Two of these men were particularly essential to the Bronfman business, Joseph Reinfeldt and the aforementioned Louis Lou Rosenstiel. The two men were of extremely different temperaments, with Reinfeldt being described as a jovial, avuncular Jewish immigrant from Poland, whereas Rosenstiel was described as loud, opinionated, and domineering. Reinfeldt served as a close advisor to Sam Bronfman, as well as an important business associate, as he was the principal purchaser of Seagram's whiskey. It was also Reinfeldt who convinced Sam to build up to build up inventory prior to and during Prohibition, which would help Bronfman secure a significant portion of the post-Prohibition liquor market. He also managed much of the in-person dealings with crime-linked individuals on Bronfman's behalf, which was key to Bronfman's winning strategy to mitigate legal risks and prevent further damage to his social reputation. The end result saw Reinfeldt buy large amounts of Seagram's liquor, mainly at rum raw, while ensuring that the Bronfmans did not have to directly deal with their final crime-linked customers. However, in at least one instance, Reinfeldt actually brought Sam Bronfman and his family business into close contact with a notorious mobster. By 1923, the Reinfeldt syndicate was half owned by Longy Twillman, who Reinfeldt sent to negotiate directly with Sam Bronfman. Bronfman was reportedly very impressed with Twillman, then in his early 20s, calling him well-behaved and studious-looking, adding that you would never guess he was a shitarka. Reinfeldt's operation during Prohibition was massive and massively profitable for Bronfman. Government investigators later revealed that Reinfeldt had imported nearly 40% of all the illicit alcohol consumed in the United States during Prohibition. Retired U.S. Treasury agents later testified that the Bronfman family were Reinfeldt's main supplier, while also alleging that much of Reinfeldt's ill-gotten profits had been laundered in Canada, some of it allegedly laundered with the help of Seagram's employees. The use of Canadian institutions as laundries for Reinfeldt is not only plausible but likely, given the intimate involvement of the Royal Bank of Canada in rum raw, the same place where Reinfeldt had received his shipments of Bronfman liquor. The Bronfmans themselves were known to operate a network of shell companies, some registered to fictitious individuals and linked to a series of both domestic and foreign bank accounts. This network facilitated the family's own elaborate money laundering operations, according to Canadian historian Stephen Schneider. The close association between Bronfman and Reinfeldt would later come back to haunt them both, particularly when Reinfeldt's longtime bodyguard, James Rutkin, testified in front of the Kefauver Committee in the early 1950s. Rutkin would tell all regarding the early days of the Bronfman family business, including the relationships of both Bronfman and Reinfeldt with mobsters like Swillman and Lansky. Some Bronfman family biographers, like Nicholas Faith, have alleged that Rutkin sought to use his testimony in a failed attempt to blackmail the Bronfmans, threatening to reveal more if he was left uncompensated. Among Rutkin's claims regarding the Bronfmans, several pertained to the family's hotel business in Canada that had preceded their liquor empire. Rutkin, describing the Bronfmans as four brothers from Montreal, teased the Kefauver committee, stating first that if you want to find out more about the Bronfman-owned hotels, you can ask the Canadian Mounted Police, and they will tell you about the little hotels, and you can use your imagination. He later added that these hotels serviced people who slept very fast, and that the same room would be rented quite a few times during the night. implying that the hotels were in fact brothels. Several Bronfman family biographers also mentioned these accusations, which had dogged the family since their earliest days in the hotel business. Some believe that Sam Bronfman tacitly confirmed that this was the case many years after Rutkin first made these claims, when he remarked, "If there were brothels, they were the best in the West." Well, that's a really stupid. I don't know, these people are all stupid. Okay. Nevertheless, in the early 1950s, at the time of the Kefauver hearings, the Bronfmans alleged that Rutkin's claims were absurd, and they declined to pony up any of the hush money that Rutkin was rumored to have been seeking. Yet, despite their best efforts, Rutkin's testimony, which received considerable publicity due to the televised broadcast of the hearings, created a whirlwind of rumors that refused to be snuffed out for some time, at least until Rutkin turned up dead, having allegedly slit his own throat with a borrowed razor in 1956. Bronfman. Cool family. Louis Rosenstiel, the other most prominent of Sam Bronfman's Prohibition-era middlemen, saw his relationship with the Seagram's chairman take a completely different trajectory than that of Bronfman and Reinfeldt. As Prohibition neared its end, Rosenstiel and Bronfman would grow into bitter rivals, despite continuing to share many of the same contacts in the North America's criminal underworld. The Chairman. While Sam Bronfman struggled with his would-be biographers, no biography was ever written of his one-time middleman and later chief rival Louis Rosenstiel. Of those books and other writings that do touch on Rosenstiel's history and demeanor, few are favorable. For instance, a 1959 piece in Esquire offers one of more favorable accounts, calling Rosenstiel intelligent, articulate, and extraordinarily aggressive, adding that he often slopes in his chair, plays with his tongue, and he speaks and utters his strong opinions with a growl expressing dislike and contempt for anyone who might disagree. Others, like Bronfman biographer Nicholas Faith, describe Rosenstiel as loud, opinionated, and domineering, a hulking figure who favored amber-tinted glasses, which he rarely removed, and large cigars to go with his status as one of the wealthiest men alive. The New York Times obituary for Rosenstiel uses similar terms, referring to the liquor baron known to many simply as the chairman, as having been a domineering man with a quick temper. Official accounts of Rosenstiel's past and how he built his company, Shenley, into a corporate behemoth seem oddly sanitized, not unlike the official accounts of the Bronfman family's early days that declined to mention the darker side of their business model that was particularly important to their activities prior to the repeal of American Prohibition. Born in 1891 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Rosenstiel, thanks to an unfortunate injury during a football match in his teenage years, dropped out of high school and went to work for his uncle at the Susquehannock Distilling Company in Milton, Kentucky in 1907. Rosenstiel worked on largely menial tasks at the facility, including a pinhooker, rolling barrels in warehouses, and as a belt splicer. His fortunes shifted dramatically from those humble beginnings during the era of American Prohibition, with little being known of his life during the period, aside from him allegedly leaving the tedious tasks of his uncle distillery behind to become a whiskey broker. According to official accounts, Rosenstiel turned to selling shoes and bonds once Prohibition set in, with his prior line of work in the distilling and sale of spirits drying up. Yet somehow the young Rosenstiel accumulated enough money to afford a vacation to the French Riviera in 1922. It was during that vacation that he would be lucky enough to score a chance meeting with Winston Churchill, who advised him, it is a quote, who advised him to prepare for return of liquor sales in the United States, quote, and per the New York Times. There is little, if any, context given in official accounts as to how or why a high school dropout turned distillery worker and shoe salesman would have attracted the attention of a notorious elitist and member of the British aristocracy like Churchill. As the story goes on, Rosenstiel spent the next 10 years of his life dutifully following Churchill's advice. He somehow convinced one of the most powerful banks on Wall Street, Lehman Brothers, to offer him a massive loan to finance his acquisition of closed distilleries and to accumulate aged whiskey inventories for the yet-to-materialize date of repeal. Again, no official explanation is offered as to how an elite banking institution like Lehman Brothers would grant someone with Rosenstiel's background such a large amount of capital based merely on advice he had received from a British politician, suggesting there is more to the story. Returning to the official narrative of Rosenstiel's rise, we are told that Rosenstiel then incorporated Shanley Distillers Company in the wake of repeal in 1933. He was conveniently well placed to become, quote, the most powerful figure in the distilled spirits business, quote, and all thanks to him having heeded Churchill's advice and thanks to a remarkable patience that he was never known to have possessed during any other point in his life. Indeed, per these same official sources, impatience rather than patience was one of Rosenstiel's most well-known traits, with his characterization by media as a domineering man with quick temper being one of many examples. Of course, as should be clear to the reader, this narrative conveniently obfuscates any hint of illegality in Rosenstiel's Prohibition-era dealings and fails to mention Rosenstiel's documented ties to organized crime figures or his role, as a prominent purchaser of Bronfman liquor alongside Joseph Reinfeldt and other Seagram's middlemen. Years later, James P. Kelly, chief investigator for the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee of the New York House of Representatives, testified under oath that Rosenstiel had been part of an underworld consortium that brought Bronfman liquor and sold it throughout the United States during Prohibition. Key figures in this consortium, aside from Rosenstiel, included Meyer Lansky, as well as Joe Fusco, an associate of Al Capone, and Joe Lindsay, a Boston-based criminal associated with Joe Kennedy's bootlegging operations. Kelly added that Rosenstiel was particularly close to Lansky, and it later emerged that they had owned points together in mob-operated businesses. He was also reportedly close to Frank Costello, who was said to have attended a business meeting alongside Rosenstiel, quote, to give the meeting attendees a message that Rosenstiel was one of their people, quote, end. One of Rosenstiel's ex-wives, Susan Kaufman, later told journalist Anthony Summers that, in Summers' words, quote, living with Rosenstiel was to live with the command structure of organized crime, quote, end. Kaufman's testimony to Summers includes numerous, specific and very detailed allegations of the various meetings between her ex-husband and organized crime figures she witnessed during their marriage, including business meetings where Rosenstiel was given, quote, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in bundles of cash, from Lansky. After Prohibition, Fusco and Lindsay took their operations into the legal and legitimate business world, just as Rosenstiel had done. They set up legitimate companies in Chicago and Boston, respectively, to market Shanley products. As a result, Rosenstiel maintained his links to the criminal underworld long after publicly transitioning from bootlegger to businessman. Frequent dinner guests at Rosenstiel's home in the years and decades after Prohibition included legendary figures of American organized crime, including Frank Costello, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky. Lansky was known to address Rosenstiel as, quote, Supreme Commander, quote, end, a name that Roy Cohn, Rosenstiel's attorney and close friend, also used for the liquor baron. Rosenstiel's transition from bootlegger to businessman very nearly included a direct partnership with Sam Bronfman. In 1929, as the end of Prohibition neared, Bronfman invested $585,000 in the Rosenstiel-owned distillery producing medicinal spirits, and had acquired a 20% stake in Rosenstiel's company. Per Sam, however, he concluded after visiting Rosenstiel's distillery that it was, quote, a piece of junk, and on the inside it was even worse, quote, end. And he was allegedly offended at the inferiority of his whiskey production method. It's unclear if this was the actual motive for their falling out, but regardless, their subsequent business and personal rivalries became legendary. According to Nicholas Faith's account on Bronfman's life, the falling out with Rosenstiel, whatever the cause, took a tremendous emotional toll on the two men before it descended into a decades-long acrimonious spat. Faith asserts that Bronfman's failure to reach an agreement with Rosenstiel, quote, really hit him, for he came down with severe flu, quote, and soon after calling off any possibility of a partnership. Despite being gravely ill, Bronfman told Rosenstiel that, quote, we have nothing to discuss, quote, and when the latter had arrived to attempt to salvage a deal. Terence Robertson's manuscript, as cited by Faith, states that Rosenstiel, quote, all but wept as he begged for just a minute with my friend, quote, end. Their feud would subsequently escalate to such an extent that it would transcend business competition, with a 1959 article in Esquire noting that either man appears, quote, appears willing to sacrifice profit to do the other in the eye, quote, end. Rosenstiel was known to refer to Bronfman and his business as, quote, unscrupulous alien competition, quote, and with alien in this instance meaning foreign, i.e. Canadian. Bronfman, for his part, was known to become angry rather quickly when Rosenstiel's name or business came up, saying he had, quote, no admiration, quote, and for the man, and would frequently refer to him as Rosenschlemiel, with Schlemiel meaning something along the lines of simpleton or born loser in Yiddish. It was also alleged that Bronfman's lavish Seagram building in New York City had been planned to make Rosenstiel's 1930s-style offices in the Empire State Building look just a little shabby in the luxury. The King of Bourbon and Blackmail. Though both men had legendary tempers and a legendary feud to match, Bronfman and Rosenstiel had major differences in character, particularly in how they managed their respective businesses and in their personal lives. One of these differences was the fact that Sam Bronfman did not share Rosenstiel's obsession with blackmail. Indeed, reports of Rosenstiel's behavior at his company's offices, as cited by Nicholas Faith, included Rosenstiel having placed, quote, bugging devices, quote, and throughout his offices. Just a note from the reader. Well, I won't always say out aloud that it is a quote. Possibly sometimes when a book is quoted or something, it becomes too annoying. Reader's site, end. I take this from the, what's it called, the guy? Rudolf Steiner Audio Press. All right, he's always saying it like this. Good, let's continue. All right. Where were we here? Per Faith, he would treat his employees like dirt, sacking them at moment's notice, and then go to the toilet to leave them time to compromise themselves by talking in his absence. Those employees were compromised as their conversations were recorded by the devices that Rosenstiel had strewn about the premises. Additional assertions made in court and under oath by one of Rosenstiel's ex-wives held that Rosenstiel had also placed microphones throughout his home in order to record conversations that took place at social events he hosted for the alleged purpose of obtaining potential blackmail against his guests. In addition, several sources reported to the 1900s. I'm laughing because it's so insane to do such things. Excuse me. In addition, several sources reported to the 1971 New York State Legislative Committee on Crime that Rosenstiel's Manhattan home had been wired from the roof to basement with hidden microphones so that he could spy on visitors and staff. The system in Rosenstiel's home had been installed by friend Otash, an infamous private detective who had used electronic means to spy on the Kennedy family, Marilyn Monroe, and others. Otash later said that Rosenstiel's home was rigged to tape conversations for hours on end. Otash had a penchant, is that French? Is that English? Penchant? Had a penchant? Penchant. Otash had a penchant for blackmail himself, particularly sexual blackmail. He had once attempted to entrap John F. Kennedy using a girl named Sui Young in the lead-up to the 1960s presidential election. As we'll see shortly, Rosenstiel was also involved in a broader effort to obtain this variety of blackmail, which may explain why he had sought out the California-based Otash to buck his New York home. Some of the sources that discuss Rosenstiel's interest in blackmail also claim that Rosenstiel was bisexual. According to Nicholas Faith, the discussions about Rosenstiel's bisexuality among Shanley office employees were frequent enough for Rosenstiel to be referred to as Rosie around the office. Additional evidence for these claims later came from Rosenstiel's fourth wife, Susan Kaufman, the fourth wife. Per Kaufman seems to be a wonderful guy, this Rosenstiel. Per Kaufman, whose previous marriage had collapsed because her first husband had been homosexual. So she soon discovered that she had made a similar mistake in marrying Rosenstiel. Rosenstiel was reportedly uninterested in having sex with his new wife, but went to great expense to have her dress up in clothes that make her look like a little girl. Excuse me. It's a complete psychopath. Excuse me, dear listeners. He would later be discovered in bed with one of his with one of his lawyers, Roy Cohn, and shrugged it off to his wife by asking for some more alone time with his attorney. Kaufman remembered responding, "I have never seen Governor Thomas Dewey in bed with you," as Dewey was also one of his attorneys at the time, and she walked out. Kaufman remembered the young Cohn, who was best known for his infamous stint as Joe McCarthy's chief counsel during the height of the Red Scare, flaunting his homosexuality whenever he was around Kaufman, openly caressing a former congressional associate in front of her and describing the homosexual antics of a close friend of his, Rosenstiel's, Cardinal Spellman, one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church in North America. Con reportedly was so open with her because her first husband had been gay, and I must have understood because I would stayed with him for 9 years, Kaufman later stated. It's very serious, ladies and gentlemen. In 1958, Kaufman accompanied her husband, Louis Rosenstiel, to a party hosted by Con at the Plaza Hotel in New York. Kaufman recalled entering through a side entrance and taking an elevator to the second or third floor. Her husband knew the way well enough that she had the impression he had been there before. The suite was one of the largest available at the hotel, and it was all done in light blue. Inside the suite were Conn and another figure, closely associated with both Conn and Rosenstiel, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. To Kaufman's surprise, Hoover was wearing woman's clothes and a wig, with Conn introducing him as Mary in a bout of barely concealed laughter. Mary was also incidentally the nickname widely used among New York Catholic clergy for Cardinal Spellman, who was also alleged to attend other parties hosted by Conn in the Plaza's blue suite. After being served a few drinks, Kaufman recalled seeing a couple of boys come in, young blonde boys, I'd say about 18 or 19, and then Roy Conn makes the signal, we should go into the bedroom. And this was a quote. As mentioned before, I cannot tell you where from where these quotes are, because they are in the text only here registered, however that's outlined, so to speak, with numbers. And if I click on the number, because I'm reading it from a PDF, then I will be in page something, and then I had to go back, and so that's why. Actually, here it would be interesting. Wait, I will check that. This is Summers. This quote was from Summers, Official and Confidential, page 293. Maybe a book worth reading. In this, actually, it's a little bit like, excuse me, these comments of mine, but it feels like some strange. It's like a book, but it's really strange things that are going on, and people that are involved here seem to be not only insane but crazy, and well, it's I don't know. It's interesting to see such people ruling the world. Okay, reader's side end. Sexual activities between the young blonde boys, Conn and Hoover, ensued, with Kaufman declining to participate after being urged to do so by her then-husband. The Rosenstiels then left, leaving the boys alone with Conn and Hoover. Conn later laughed about the incident to Kaufman, saying that Mary Hoover attends his parties regularly and that he would make sure to arrive at the plaza first with his clothes, the female clothes allegedly used by Hoover at the parties, in a suitcase. This was a quote, again, from the same book that I was mentioning before. Per her testimony, Kaufman was repulsed by the whole affair, but ended up attending another of these parties at the plaza after Rosenstiel bribed her with an expensive pair of earrings from Harry Winston's. Well, this woman is also a little bit cheap. The events of that evening played out as they had the time before, but the Rosenstiels later quarreled, and she never attended any more Conn-hosted parties at the Plaza Hotel. I think I have to make a pause soon after these confusing things, because my mind is thinking, what the heck is this? Then, well, but I will read one page more. These allegations made by Kaufman resulted in considerable efforts to discredit her testimony, especially during the 1971 New York State Legislative Committee on Crime. Kaufman had agreed to serve as a witness for the state regarding her ex-husband's ties to organized crime figures. The very week that she was due to testify, Kaufman was hit with an attempted perjury charge that was regarded as unprecedented and bizarre by lawyers and outraged the committee's chairman and chief counsel. Kaufman still testified, but mostly behind closed doors, in executive session. Her testimony, several decades later, still remains sealed. Members of the committee believed at the time that the attempted perjury charges had been instigated by Louis Rosenstiel himself in order to prevent his wife from testifying, as he had previously used similar tactics to protect his corrupt dealings. This attempted perjury charge has since been used by some authors to discredit Kaufman's later testimony regarding her ex-husband and his associates. However, the former chief counsel of the crime committee, New York Judge Edward McLaughlin, and committee investigator William Gallinero found Kaufman to be an exceptionally good witness. McLaughlin later told journalist and Hoover biographer Anthony Summers, "I thought her absolutely truthful. The woman's power of recall was phenomenal. Everything she said was checked and double-checked, and everything that was checkable turned out to be true." Additional evidence corroborating Kaufman as a witness came from two male witnesses who supported the astonishing allegations of Hoover's habit of cross-dressing, with those witnesses having learned of the former FBI director's habit at a different time and place than the events described by Kaufman. They also had no knowledge of Hoover and the blue suit parties in New York. While reading this, excuse me again that I'm talking, I'm thinking of that movie. I think this Hoover guy has even an own movie. Leonardo DiCaprio, I think, is playing him. I would be interested if such stuff is shown there. I have to watch that movie somewhere. But it was really boring. I started it once. Okay. In a moment, I'm done with this page. Then I will make a pause, and then the reader will, the listener, the reader is me, will again have some more serious reading. In addition, Kaufman told Anthony Summers that she possessed photographs showing Hoover in the company of Louis Rosensteel's organized crime associates. Though Summers did not see these pictures personally, they were confirmed as authentic and had been seen by journalist Mary Nichols of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Nichols told Summers she did have suitcases of photographs that she had hauled away from her marriage to Louis Rosensteel. The ones I saw showed Hoover, lawyer Roe Cohn, and Rosensteel at all sorts of social events with mobsters. There's also evidence that not only did these parties at the Plaza Hotel take place, but that they were used to obtain sexual blackmail, with Kaufman asserting that her husband possessed pictures of Hoover wearing women's clothes, and that those images had been passed to Rosensteel's associate, mobster Meyer Lansky. Journalist and author Anthony Summers had noted that, given Rosensteel's interest and ability to have his residences and businesses bugged, Rosensteel was quite capable of having the sex sessions at the plaza bugged or arranging for Edgar to be photographed in his female costumes. In addition, New York attorney John Klotz, tasked with investigating Roy Cohn for a case well after Kaufman's testimony, independently found evidence of the blue suit at the Plaza Hotel and its role in a sex extortion ring after combing through local government documents and information gathered by private detectives. It allegedly involved minors as well as young men, aged 18 and older. Klotz later summarized his findings, telling journalist and author Burton Hirsch, quote, "Roy Cohn was providing protection. There were a bunch of pedophiles involved. That's where Cohn got his power from. Blackmail." Quote end. I will make a pause so that I will be a little bit more serious now in the following pages. Further confirmation of Rosensteel's and Cohn's activities in the blue suit, later determined to be suit 233, comes from statements made by Cohn himself to former NIPD detective and ex-head of the department's Human Trafficking and Vice-Related Crimes Division, James Rothstein. Rothstein later told John DeCamp, a former Nebraska state senator who investigated the Franklin scandal of the 1980s, that Cohn had admitted to being part of a sexual blackmail operation targeting politicians with minors during a sit-down interview with the former detective. Rothstein told DeCamp the following about Cohn, quote, "Cohn's job was to run the little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman, who did not want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up. Then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself." Quote end. Rothstein later told Paul David Collins, a former journalist turned researcher, that Conn had also identified this sexual blackmail operation as being part of the anti-communist crusade of the time. The fact that Conn, per Rothstein's recollection, stated that this sex blackmail ring was part of the anti-communist crusade, coupled with Hoover's involvement in these blue suit events, suggests that elements of the government, including Hoover's FBI, may have been connected at a much broader level to the operation in a way that transcended Hoover's own personal involvement. Rothstein confirmed his statements to both DeCamp and Collins in an interview with me that was conducted in early 2020. He additionally told me that Conn had told him that this role in this ring had originally come about because he himself had been entrapped and blackmailed, leading Rothstein to feel some sort of sympathy for Conn. For those that may find it hard to believe that such an operation would take place with the involvement of the FBI director, there are also other related allegations to consider that American intelligence operatives and organized crime had competed and then collaborated to blackmail Hoover years before Kaufman witnessed these events at the Plaza Hotel, beginning in 1958. Lansky was credited with obtaining compromising photos of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sometime in the 1940s, which showed Hoover in some kind of gay situation. According to a former Lansky associate, who also said that Lansky had often said of Hoover, "I fixed that son of a bitch." Maya Lansky's widow also later claimed that her husband had acquired hard proof of Hoover's homosexuality and used it to neutralize the FBI as a threat to his own operations. The photos showed Hoover engaged in sexual activity, specifically oral sex with his longtime friend FBI Deputy Director Clyde Tolson. There is considerable separate evidence from the period that the close professional relationship between Hoover and Tolson was also intimate and that this was an open secret in Washington. At some point, these photos fell into the hands of CIA counterintelligence chief James J. Angleton, who later showed the photos to several other CIA officials, including John Weitz and Gordon Novel. Both Weitz and Novel later stated that the pictures they had seen showed Hoover engaged in oral sex on a man who Angleton identified as Tolson. However, only Hoover's face was recognizable in the photographs. Angleton also claimed that the photos had been taken in 1946. Angleton was in charge of the CIA's relationship with the FBI, as well as Israeli intelligence until he left the agency in 1972. Angleton was also a CIA figure who had pushed for the agency to forge ties with Meyer Lansky, raising the possibility that Angleton could have received the photo from Lansky. However, Anthony Summers, in Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, has argued that it was not Lansky, but William Donovan, the director of the OSS, who obtained the original photos of Hoover, and either he or another person at the OSS or early CIA had later shared them with Lansky. Summers also states that to gangster Frank Costello and Lansky, the ability to corrupt politicians, policemen, and judges was fundamental to mafia operations. The way they found to deal with Hoover, according to several mob sources, involved his homosexuality. With the mobster associates of Rosenstiel being under significantly more pressure during the 1950s, in large part thanks to the Kefauver Committee, it's possible that Hoover's appearances at the Plaza Hotel may have served as additional insurance for these interests. Hoover, for his part, was likely already used to the realities of being blackmailed by this point, given that his private sex life had been known to the mob and the US intelligence community for years. He likely saw the opportunity to partake in the scheme as a means of amassing his own massive collection of blackmail. With thick dossiers on friend and foe alike, Hoover's office contained secret files on numerous powerful people in Washington and beyond, files he used to gain favors and protect his status as FBI director for as long as he wished. Even former OSS veterans like Richard Helms have made such claims, alleging that Hoover played a very skillful game with knowledge of the sexual habits of prominent people. Further evidence for this comes from journalist and author Burton Hirsch, who alleges in his book Bobby and J. Edgar the historic face-off between the Kennedys and J. Edgar Hoover that transformed America. That's the title of the book. That Hoover had also been tied to Sherman Kaminsky, who helped run a sexual blackmail operation in New York that involved young male prostitutes. Kaminsky claimed to have been New York bred, but federal investigators later stated he was originally from Baltimore. Some reports claim Kaminsky had ties to Israel, having served in the Israel Defense Forces. The ring, which was called the Chickens and the Bulls by the NIPD, targeted prominent men who were closeted homosexuals throughout the United States, many of them married with families. Among those who had been blackmailed were a Navy admiral, 2 generals, a U.S. congressman, a prominent surgeon, an Ivy League professor, and well-known actors and television personalities. That operation was busted and investigated in a 1966 extortion probe led by Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan, though the FBI quickly took over the investigation and photos showing Hoover and Kaminsky together soon disappeared from the case file. Kaminsky successfully avoided arrest for 11 years, having disappeared from a New York courthouse undetected during his sentencing hearing. Why would Hoover have been involved with the activities of Kaminsky? There are only a few possibilities. One possibility is that Hoover had been blackmailed by Kaminsky, though it's more likely that Kaminsky instead had ties to figures in organized crime that had already blackmailed Hoover long before. Another possibility is that Hoover was cozy to a second sexual blackmail operation targeting closed-head homosexual men because he sought to pad his own library of blackmail for personal and professional gain. What does seem clear is that Hoover, as well aware of the power that amassing blackmail afforded, and was willing to indulge in taboo behavior at the Blue Suit because he was no longer concerned about being extorted or manipulated with sexual blackmail in ways that would end his career or destroy his public image. He had fallen in with the very crowd that had reportedly blackmailed him, later developing a symbiotic relationship with that same network. The most obvious and troubling symptom of this symbiosis was Hoover's reluctance to tackle organized crime as FBI director. Hoover repeatedly declined to use the Bureau to target organized crime networks, referring to organized crime as a local problem in which the FBI did not need to intervene for most of his nearly 50-year stint as the top law enforcement administrator in the country. According to congressional crime consultant Ralph Salerno, Hoover's apparent aversion to targeting organized crime networks, such as those in which Rosenstiel and Lansky figured prominently, allowed organized crime to grow very strong in economic and political terms, so that it became a much bigger threat to the well-being of this country than it would have been if it had been addressed much sooner. Business as usual. Other aspects of Hoover's symbiotic relationship with these organized crime-tinged networks can also be seen in Hoover's ties to Rosenstiel and Rosenstiel's close associate Roy Cohn in the above-board worlds of legitimate business and politics. Most records place the beginning of Hoover's relationship with Rosenstiel as occurring in the 1950s, the same decade that Hoover was allegedly attending Rosenstiel's blackmail parties. Rosenstiel's FBI file, obtained by Anthony Summers, cites the first Rosenstiel meeting as taking place in 1956. After requesting that meeting, Rosenstiel was granted a personal face-to-face meeting with the director in a matter of hours, a rare feat. However, Summers notes that there is evidence that the two men had met much earlier, as Hoover was on record showing an unusual concern in the FBI's handling of Rosensteel's criminal links as early as 1939. The blue suit parties and blackmail may also explain the uncharacteristic ease with which a young Roy Cohn was able to meet with J. Edgar Hoover upon his arrival as a young man in Washington, D.C. in 1952, an event that has puzzled Cohn's biographers. Roy Cohn's account of how he was able to meet Hoover in person, deemed improbable by Cohn biographer Nicholas von Hoffman, involves Hoover calling Cohn after the latter had unsuccessfully sought to go through the normal channels to communicate with the FBI director. Cohn, only in his mid-20s, had been seeking Hoover's aid in gathering support for a controversial presentment which alleged communist subversion among United Nations staff. Hoover, who is supposed to be talking to Cohn for the first time per official accounts, is alleged to have said, "Roy, are you trying to see me?" To that, Cohn claimed to have responded, "You are darn right, I'm trying to see you. It's been rather difficult." Hoover then offered, "Whenever you want to see me, you just pick up the phone and ask for me, and you will be able to see me." "Well, when can I see you?" Cohn had asked, with the director then saying, "Come on over." Per Cohn, he was then seated in front of Hoover within 10 minutes. Von Hoffman, who notes elsewhere in his Cohn biography that some of Cohn's unlikely stories do turn out to be true, notes that the story is improbable, in part because the only tie he could find between Cohn and Hoover at the time was a connection to George Sokolsky, the director of the American Jewish League Against Communism. Also unlikely, per Van Hoffman, was Hoover alleged urging to Roy that, "When you want to see me, call me directly, don't go through channels. The Justice Department is monitoring your calls at your own office across the way." Von Hoffman states that this degree of frankness with a junior whom he had only recently met is at odds with Hoover's reputation as one of the most adept of mountain goats in negotiating the trails and passes of the federal bureaucracy. Von Hoffman asks, would merely sharing a political outlook on the dangers of communism be enough to seduce Hoover, who was never indiscreet, into such indiscretions as advising Roy, all else failing, to threaten to quit and back it up by calling a press conference if there were no other way to shake the presentment loose? Von Hoffman concludes that Cohn's story was inaccurate, though he notes that Roy's account of what Hoover told him is a story that somebody with a dangerous secret to hide might tell. However, in the context of the blue suit parties at the Plaza Hotel, it's certainly possible that both Cohn's account of his first official meeting with Hoover and his harboring of a dangerous secret are both true. This is supported from press reports of the same period that claimed that soon after Cohn caught Hoover's eye in Washington, D.C., Hoover showered Cohn with compliments and notes and photographs. Author Burton Hirsch similarly asserts that soon after meeting Hoover and Cohn traded favors, effusive compliments, gifts, and elaborate private dinners. It quickly became Roy and Edgar. The official story also holds that the only bond initially shared between Rosensteel and Cohn, as it is alleged with Hoover and Cohn, was a shared commitment to anti-communism, which has similarly left biographers and observers of their relationship puzzled by improbable anecdotes similar to that described above. Yet, in an era where the Red Scare raged alongside the so-called Lavender Scare, which targeted homosexuals with the same fervor as the Red Scare targeted communists, the bonds forged between a group of men who shared their forbidden passions in a milieu of secretive orgies, blackmail, and organized crime would have fostered a much stronger sense of camaraderie. The surprising closeness shared among Rosensteel, Cohn, and Hoover can be seen in other arrangements. For instance, soon after meeting Hoover officially for the first time in 1956, Hoover sent Rosensteel flowers when the latter fell ill. A year later, Rosensteel was heard telling Hoover, "Your wish is my command. during a meeting. That same year, Louis B. Nichols, Hoover's number 2 at the Bureau for decades, was hired to become executive vice president of Rosenstiel's empire of Shanley. Around this time, it was reported that Rosenstiel had bought large quantities of books about Hoover and distributed them as gifts. In addition, Rosenstiel had also bought no less than 25,000 copies of Masters of Deceit, a book written by Hoover about how to fight communism in the United States, which he sent to schools around the country. A few years later, in 1965, Nichols incorporated the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation. Rosenstiel was the principal contributor, giving the foundation 1,000 shares of Shanley stock. Nichols also gave a smaller, yet unknown amount of Shanley shares to the foundation, while the American Jewish League Against Communism, of which Roy Cohn was now president, gave $500 to help start the foundation. A year later, the Dorothy H. and Louis Rosenstiel Foundation gave $50,000 to the foundation. In 1968, the Rosenstiel Foundation gave an additional $1 million to the foundation that was made in the form of bonds of the Glen Alden Corporation, which took over Shanley Industries that same year. A 1969 report in the Washington Post later noted that nearly everyone directly associated with Nichols in the Hoover Foundation is or was connected with either the FBI or Shanley's. The report also noted that, despite lofty promises regarding the foundation's activities, it spent hardly any money at the time the Washington Post's report was published in 1969, suggesting that something about the foundation's activities during that period was odd. Around this same period, Rosenstiel began to retire, selling his controlling interest to Glen Alden in 1968, and resigning as chairman and CEO of Shanley. While it seemed that Cohn would serve as Rosenstiel's successor in matters of blackmail, it seems another man served as his successor in matters of business. Per Rosenstiel's New York Times obituary, around the time he sold his control of Shanley to Glen Alden and retired, he also sold his Manhattan townhouse, backed for blackmail, to Israeli-American businessman Meshulam Riklis. Riklis was then an influential figure at Glen Alden, whose rise had been regarded with skepticism by Wall Street and the press. Indeed, Riklis had absorbed so many companies, including Glen Alden, Shanley, in 1972 into his rapid American corporation that he was forced to defend himself publicly, insisting that the fuel for his corporate takeovers involved no mystery money, no unnamed associates, no Swiss bank money. Now, following the endnotes of that chapter, and we continue with Chapter 3, Organized Crime and the State of Israel. State Building. In its July 1971 obituary for Samuel Bronfman, the New York Times wrote that after World War II, the liquor baron had helped finance a secret purchase of Canadian weapons for troops of the Haganah. Additional details on Bronfman's role in that purchase, beyond its brief mention by the Times, are rather difficult to come by. Peter Newman, in his otherwise exhaustive The Bronfman Dynasty, writes that Sam personally underwrote life insurance policies for Canadian pilots recruited to help Israel fight its 1948 War of Independence. However, it is also known that a few years after Israel's creation, in 1951, Bronfman would play a leading role in a similar secret purchase of the Haganah's successor, the Israel Defense Force, IDF. In that case, Bronfman specifically answered the call of Israel's Shimon Peres, taking Peres to Ottawa, Canada, to negotiate the transfer for $2 million worth of weapons to Israel. Bronfman then raised funds to cover the entire cost of the sizable arms cage. Yet, aside from that, little is known of his earlier role in arming Zionist paramilitaries prior to Israel's founding. As Newman noted, Bronfman preferred to remain tight-lipped on Zionist matters, despite his position as head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, an example of the family's characteristic quiet manipulation. Regardless of the exact nature of Bronfman's activities in this area, his connection to the Haganah was not unique for those in his social circles. Yet even outside of Bronfman's contacts, efforts to aid the Zionist paramilitary group, which would later form the backbone of the IDF, were already indicative of a wider tendency in pro-Zionist activism that swept across Canada, America, Latin America, and beyond during the late 1940s. What was at stake was the creation of Israel itself, as a sovereign political entity independent of the British, who, until 1948, had controlled mandatory Palestine in accordance with treaties set up at the end of World War I. When the British mandate ended in May 1958, Israel declared itself independent and immediately entered into conflict with the Palestinians and a coalition of Arab forces. Those fighting to create Israel were able to assert themselves so forcefully largely because of the careful groundwork that had been laid out in advance by a number of individuals and groups, many of them working in the shadows. Such was the historical mission of the Haganah Defense, an organized Zionist paramilitary network that had been set up by the Jewish Agency, an activist branch of the World Zionist Organization, short WZO. The Jewish Agency, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, oversaw the creation of numerous towns, villages, communal outposts, and defense groups in mandatory Palestine. The Jewish Agency would later atrophy, only to be relaunched by one of Leslie Wexner's mentors, Max Fisher, in 1970. The formation of the Haganah in 1920 was a major step forward towards the formation of the Israeli state. Vital to its functioning was the training and arms provided by the British military. Major General Ord Charles Wingate, who had been dispatched to help administer British control over the territories, worked closely with the Haganah. Wingate even organized joint British Army Zionist paramilitary commando units dedicated to patrolling and suppressing Arab elements in the region. These were called the Special Night Squads. Yeah, that sounds like horrible. As most of the last 50 minutes. So, in 1945, the Haganah began its effort to stockpile weapons, ammunition, aircraft, non-lethal supplies, and machine tools sourced from around the globe. In the US, Ben-Gurion reached out to a close associate, Zionist activist Rudolf Sonneborn, who had traveled to Palestine years earlier to survey the construction of Jewish villages on behalf of the World Zionist Organization. Under the leadership of Sonneborn, 18 or so Jewish millionaires and billionaires were recruited into bankrolling the supply effort. Thus, the Sonneborn Institute, as it was known, was born. The Institute, an activist collaboration of Zionist millionaires and billionaires that pursued specific Zionism-related causes, would later serve as sort of a model for the mega group, founded years later by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman in 1991. The Sonneborn Institute's chief asset was a Haganah operative named Yehuda Arazi. During World War II, he served as a soldier in the Jewish Brigade, a British Army unit that recruited its fighters from the immigrant populations living in mandatory Palestine. By 1945, he was an old hand at gun running. Indeed, Arazi had been active smuggling arms for the Haganah into Palestine from Europe since 1938. Through these efforts, he developed an impressive roster of contacts, many of whom were tapped to set up front companies through which the Sonneborn Institute and the Haganah could carry out their activities. Ricky Dale Calhoun wrote that, quote, one Arazi associate was Leonard Wiseman, who was probably a member of the Sonneborn group. Wiseman was a 34-year-old from Pittsburgh who had made a fortune in scrap metals and construction materials. His businesses included Materials Redistribution Company, a firm that dealt in scrap machinery, Paragon Design and Development Corporation, a company that traded in building materials, and Pratt Steamship Lines, a fourth Wiseman company. Foundry Associates, Inc. existed only on paper. All assisted in the purchase and illegal export of arms from the United States. Quote end. Other front companies were organized by Nahum Bernstein, an attorney in New York City, that were used to source weapons and or construct them from spare parts and then export them overseas. Bernstein's name can be found on the corporate registrations of firms like Machinery Processing and Converting Company, which provided cover for the purchase and illegal export of arms-making machines as well as armaments, and Oved Trading Company, which supplied legal cover for buying and transporting explosives. There was also a trio of interlaced companies: Materials for Palestine, Inland Machinery and Metal Company, and the Eastern Development Company. Materials for Palestine was a charity through which money could be raised, while Inland Machinery actively shipped armaments and lethal munitions. Eastern Development, meanwhile, exported legal non-military goods and machinery to Palestine as relief supplies. There is a possibility that Paul Halliwell, discussed in Chapter 1, had some connection to this company, as he was listed as the attorney for the similarly named Eastern Development Corporation. According to a 1951 article in the Miami News, this Eastern Development was doing business in Florida, but had been formed in Pittsburgh. As mentioned above, Leonard Wiseman, the probable Sonneborn Group member who worked with Arazi to create fronts for arms exporting, was also from Pittsburgh. The potential presence of Halliwell in this mesh leads naturally to another question. Was organized crime also involved in these efforts? Unlike the mysteries around Eastern Development, the role of organized crime in covertly arming the Haganah is well documented. As these unofficial arms trade networks spread across the U.S., gangsters and mobsters, many of whom actively identified with the Zionist cause, threw their hats into the ring. Early on, Arazi forged ties with Meyer Lansky, requesting aid in maritime transit for the arms. Lansky, in turn, contacted two of his associates who controlled New York City's docks and the Longshoremen's Union, Alberta Anastasia and Joe Adonis. The trio then helped Israeli agents conceal the arms purchased for Israel, while arms bound for Egypt mysteriously fell overboard. Lansky's close associate Baxi Siegel met with Roy van Daphne, a representative of the Haganah looking to raise funds. Daphne, as the story goes, told Siegel that the Zionists were looking to unshackle themselves from British rule and that the path to do this was to fight. Siegel told Daphne, "I'm with you." And for several weeks afterwards, the Haganah would receive suitcases filled with $5 and $10 bills, $50,000 in all. Besides Lansky, one of the more active mobsters in the flow of arms was Joseph Bayonne Joe Ziccarelli. According to files obtained from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Ziccarelli was alleged to have been involved in the traffic of arms and munitions sold to the government of Israel. It was one of many destinations for Ziccarelli's arms. He also brokered arms sales to Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. The latter, as will be discussed shortly, was also active in the acquisition of arms for Israel. Ziccarelli was close to Carmine Galante, a key player in the Bonanno Mafia family, who would later become one of Roy Cohn's main clients from the criminal underworld. Allegedly, Ziccarelli had been the subject of a feud between Charles Turenne of the Genovese family and Galante, with each wanting to recruit him into their crime family. Galante won out, and it was under his watch that Ziccarelli's lucrative arms trade flourished. At one point in the 1950s, Ziccarelli was dispatched to Montreal by Galante to work with the Canadian mobster Vincenzo Cotroni. Together, Ziccarelli and Cotroni organized the import of large sums of heroin into the country as part of the Canadian wing of the French connection. Ziccarelli was also alleged to be a close business associate of Louis Rosenstiel. Rosenstiel's fourth wife, Susan Kaufman, testified that Ziccarelli had been a secret partner New Jersey warehouses owned by Shanley Industries, Rosenstiel's company. She further alleged that Rosenstiel had meetings with Ziccarelli and Mayalanski. The connection to Shanley signaled Ziccarelli's penchant for involving himself in quasi-legitimate businesses that acted as both above-board profit turners and as fronts for less than reputable activities. Another one of these businesses was ABCO Vending, a cigarette vending machine company that was controlled by Ziccarelli and Galante. Joining them there was Erwin Steve Schwartz, who later became infamous in the 1970s for his involvement in costly stock manipulation schemes. FBN files describe Schwartz as representing the Galante-Ziccarelli interests in the arms traffic, promotion and sale of worthless stocks and securities, and the cigarette vending business. Before adding that, since 1947, Schwartz has been engaged in the traffic of arms, a good portion of which have been obtained from communist bloc nations and shipped first to Israel and later to Cuba. Associated with Schwartz in these ventures were Irving Schindler and Adolf Schwimmer. Adolf L. Schwimmer was the founder of Israel Aircraft Industries, one of the country's great military contractors, known today as Israel Aerospace Industries, IAI. During the 1930s, he worked for Lockheed and TWA, and after World War II broke out, he was affiliated in some capacity with the U.S. Air Transport Command. Schwimmer would remain active down through the decades with a tendency to crop up in various Cold War-era covert operations. Perhaps most notoriously, he emerged as a key player on the Israeli side of the Iran-Contra affair, and by some accounts was the individual who conceived of the arms for hostages plot at the center of Oliver North's complicated web. As for IAI, that's the way, it would become owned years later by Israel's richest man, Shaul Eisenberg. Under Eisenberg, IAI would have close ties to Israeli intelligence, from which he drew most of the company's senior staff. In his work, securing materials for the Haganah, Schwimmer worked closely with Irvin Swiftly Schindler. Schindler owned an air freight company called Service Air, which Schwimmer relocated to California with funds from the Haganah. And together, Schwimmer and Schindler utilized the company as a means of acquiring aircraft and aircraft parts to be shipped to Palestine. Yet, with an embargo in place due to President Truman's declaration of neutrality, Service Air was prohibited from sending them overseas. Schwimmer and Schindler, aided by Arazi, turned to the Haganah's contacts in Panama. Soon, legal ownership of the airplanes was transferred to the newly established Panamanian national airline LAPSA, allowing the aircraft to be legally flown to Panama, and from there they were moved abroad. In Chapter 7, which details the Iran-Contra affair, Israel's close-knit relationship with Panama is mentioned in greater detail. Yet the origins of this relationship began here, with the efforts of the Haganah to arm Zionist forces in Palestine following World War II. It wasn't, however, the only country in that region to have similar connections to Israel. Many of the people discussed in this chapter, like Bayonne, Joe, Ziccarelli, were actively working with the anti-communist forces in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and elsewhere, at the same time that they were working with the Haganah. One particularly important anti-communist force that was collaborating with the Haganah was the Somoza regime in Nicaragua. The special relationship between the Zionist cause and Somoza's Nicaragua was largely due to the heavy presence of United Fruit, the New York-Boston banana trading company, whose influence... that sounds funny. the New York Boston Banana Trading Company, United Fruit. Imagine, people do large, huge businesses call them United Fruit, which are about, banana trading. It's just, yeah, why not? Whose influence in Latin America was to be fundamentally intertwined with the CIA's activities in the region. In 1933, United Fruit had fallen under the control of Samuel Zemurray, whose Cuyamail Fruit Company, a favorite of top Wall Street firms like Lehman and Goldman Sachs, had merged with the company several years prior. Zemurray, during the 1940s, was a big backer of Zionist causes. He aided the supply of arms to the Haganah and reportedly helped the organization acquire the SS Exodus, a steamship used to ferry refugees to Palestine in 1946. United Fruit, which later became United Brands, is discussed throughout this book due to its persisting intelligence connections, as well as the fact its main leadership later included members of Leslie Wexner's inner circle and his two main mentors, Max Fisher and A. Alfred Taubman. By 1947, as Truman's embargo began to be enforced, Nicaragua started providing arms to the Haganah. Somoza reportedly profited directly from this venture. He received 3.5% commission on all arms purchases made by the Haganah under Nicaraguan aegis. A decade later, Israel returned the favor when Shimon Peres negotiated an arms deal with Somoza that transformed Israel's emergent military-industrial complex into the primary supplier of weapons for Nicaragua. As will be discussed in Chapter 7, Israel was active in arming and training the Nicaraguan Contras, the US-backed paramilitary forces that opposed the Sandinista government, which had toppled the Somoza regime in the late 1970s. The entry of Israel into this conflict was guaranteed by this precise history, and the Reagan administration, as part of its propaganda campaign, was quick to paint the new Sandinista-led government as violently anti-Semitic. The relationship between the Haganah and Latin America wasn't solely dependent upon the graces of Zemurray and United Fruit. Reportedly, Haganah officers called upon the services of Sam Kay, a Florida businessman and real estate developer who had extensive contacts in Panama, Batistas, Cuba, and elsewhere. FBI files describe Kay as a reputed international gangster, and one of his close business associates was the Miami Beach Hotel impresario Morris Landsberg, who was himself a frontman for Meyer Lansky. Kay would later be linked to Florida mob boss Santo Traficante, through the two were purported to have had failing out that would almost cost Kay his life. To have had a failing out that would almost cost Kay his life. It was at this point where the Zionist interests melded with organized crime's real estate ventures, casino operations and slush funds at the door of the Caribbean. Soon these connections would truly begin to sprawl outwards and became truly intercontinental in scope. The hot money web. During the Second World War, writes Jim Hogan, During the Second World War, writes Jim Hogan, Tiber Rosenbaum became a hero for the resistance through his activities on behalf of the Jews, using Istvan Lukács as a nom de guerre, not possibly a guy of the war or something. He carried out a series of Mission Impossible rescues. Mission Impossible rescues. In one instance, he posed a high-ranking Nazi officer, entered a concentration camp, and under administrative pretext obtained the release of 30 doomed prisoners. His subsequent activities, however, were less than heroic. With high-level connections secured through his position as delegate for the World Zionist Congress, Rosenbaum set up his Geneva Bank, International Credit Bank, ICB. ICB regularly moved money for Mossad and for Israel's Ministry of Defense. The British Sunday Times later reported in 1975 that as much as 90% of the Israeli Defense Ministry's external budget flowed through Rosenbaum's bank. It also moved money for organized crime. In 1967, an exposé in Life magazine fingered ICB as the recipient of large sums of money skimmed off by the mob from the casinos they owned in Las Vegas, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Overseeing the complex chains of interbank relations and transfer chains that enabled this hot money to flow around the globe was a series of banking institutions controlled by whom? By Meyer Lansky's frontman. The setup was essentially as follows. Casino skim, as well as profits generated by the drug trade and other organized crime rackets, was moved into two key offshore banks, the Bank of World Commerce, BWC, and Atlas Bank, the latter of which was a subsidiary of Rosenbaum's ICB. The funds would then be moved to accounts held by ICB in Geneva, where they would be converted into loans and investments to complete the money laundering loop. As will be discussed shortly, some of these funds may have been used to finance real estate investments that were made by people connected to American and Israeli intelligence. The organizer of Atlas on behalf of ICB was Sylvain Ferdman. The exposé in Life described Ferdman as a Swiss citizen who is an international banker and economist, before adding that US authorities have marked Ferdman as fugitive, accused of interfering with the federal inquiry into the skimming racket. Working alongside Ferdman and Rosenbaum was a coterie of Lansky's closest allies. Sitting on the board of ICB itself was Ed Levinson and John Pullman. Levinson, who was partnered with Lansky in the Miami International Airport Hotel, ran the mob-controlled Fremont Hotel Casino in Las Vegas. Levinson was also tight with Clifford Jones, the lieutenant governor of Nevada, between 1947 and 1954, who was also an alleged associate of Meyer Lansky. Sitting alongside Levinson on the ICB board was John Pullman, Lansky's personal financial advisor. Pullman was also close to Lou Chesler, having become acquainted with the Canadian businessman in the 1940s. He subsequently introduced Chesler into Lansky's orbit. Soon, Chesler began managing Lansky's interests in the Bahamas, including the development of hotels and casinos. At the same time, Pullman was organizing the Bank of World Commerce, the partner bank to Atlas Bank and correspondent bank to ICB. Levinson and Pullman also sat on the board of BWC. In German we say V. I always make that mistake. BWC. An IRS report aptly described this bank as having been set up to maintain a liquid supply of funds to be used for setting up new gambling casinos in the Caribbean wherever and whenever the opportunity presents itself. They were joined on the board by Benjamin Siegelbaum, a money courier for Lansky and a prominent figure in organized crime circles in his own right. Besides BWC, Siegelbaum held posts at the Exchange and Investment Bank, a sort of Geneva-based counterpart bank to Rosenbaum's ICB. R.T. Naylor, in his book Hot Money and the Politics of Debt, writes that for a time Exchange and Investment Bank was Lansky's preferred financial institution, at least until his role in the bank was accidentally exposed by Chase Manhattan. This occurred after the bank found two of their employees using accounts there to spirit away embezzled funds. It was at this point that Lansky shifted the bulk of his business to Rosenbaum's bank. Aside from Geneva banking, Siegelbaum also dabbled in Florida real estate. His money backed one of the state's large landowners, Major Realty, which had been co-founded by a Florida entrepreneur named Max Orovitz. Orovitz was, as Jonathan Marshall points out, a legitimate businessman and an honored Jewish philanthropist, but no stranger to criminals. He was partnered with Lou Chesler in both Florida real estate, albeit via Chesler's general development company, not Major Realty, and in development projects in the Bahamas that ultimately spawned Resorts International, which was previously Mary Carter Paint and had been linked to both the mob, to former New York Governor Thomas Dewey and to Paul Halliwell's Castle Bank. Horowitz was part of what was known as the Miami Group, a circle of organized crime-linked Jewish businessmen with holdings across various economic sectors in Florida and Israel. Members of the Miami Group established Dan Hotels, a luxury hotel chain with locations in Israel and India, and also set up Israel's first successful oil drilling company, Israel Oil Ventures. Very creatively. Israel Oil Ventures expanded its capacities considerably in 1960 when it purchased Israel American Oil Corp., an oil venture that was intimately tied to organized crime via its holding in another oil firm, Rimrock Tidelands. A subsidiary of Rimrock Tidelands, Rimrock International, was out of interest to a Senate investigation into international narcotics traffic. This was because Rimrock International's managing director was Santos Sorge, who was described in the Senate report as one of the most important mafia leaders and the liaison, however that word actually is pronounced, between American and Sicilian mafia clans. Compared to its fellow dark money conduits, Atlas Bank, later renamed Atlas Trust, is something of a mystery. It not only sat at the intersection of Geneva-bound money flows, but was also tied to hot money from the Middle East. According to Alan Block, Atlas was united in some shadowy way with Intra Bank in Beirut, Lebanon, which maintained its own offshore entity in the Bahamas called Intra Bahamas Trust Ltd. Intra Bank was formed in 1951 by Youssef Beidas, a Christian Palestinian refugee who had been born into a prominent banking family. Just over a decade later, what began as a modest operation ballooned into a sprawling empire, at which point Beidas forged agreements with leading American banks. These included Bank of America and Chase Manhattan, and Beidas then placed branches of Intrabank in the world's important hotspots for hot money, London, Geneva, and the Caribbean. At home, in Lebanon, Intra held 20% of the country's total deposits and 56% of all the country's banking assets. There was also a deep relationship between Intrabank and illicit activities of all types. As Jonathan Marshall notes, quote, smugglers of all sorts availed themselves of Intrabank services. It was a prime depository for many of the world's leading arms traffickers, who received financing from Lebanese traders for illegal weapons sales and in the southern Arabian Peninsula, Yemen and Aden, Cyprus, Sudan, Nigeria, Rhodesia, South Africa and Kurdish communities in the Middle East. Wealthy Arabs with too many petrodollars on their hands, looking for a savvy bank in the region to look after their wealth, fattened its deposits further. Lebanon was prized as a haven for cash for anybody with a balance to hide. U.S. tax evaders, oil-rich sheiks who want to lay something by for the rainy day of revolution, and assorted racketeers and purveyors of stolen or smuggled wealth from all over the world, observed Life magazine in 1967. Quote end. Naturally, this sort of environment made Intrabank an attractive financial institution for the CIA, and the bank helped transform Beirut into a core hub for the agency's covert operations in the Middle East. Marshall reports that Beidas, in particular, had a personal touch when it came to dealing with the CIA. He was even seen taking CIA officers into his private office to handle their checks. Sitting on the board of directors of Intrabank with Kamal Adham, the head of Saudi intelligence and the cousin of the infamous arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, a later key player in Iran-Contra, the BCCI affair, and numerous other covert activities, According to the congressional BCCI report, Adnan was the CIA's principal liaison for the entire Middle East from the mid-1960s through 1979. Intrabank was identified by American law enforcement as being a major laundromat and source of funding for the global drug trade, a sizable portion of which was based in Lebanon. This was thanks to the country's position as a key node in the famed French Connection, as Lebanon was a major source of hashish, raw opium, and even refined heroin that was destined for black markets in Europe and North America. This node of the international drug trade was largely controlled by Sami Kouari and his partner Omar Makouk. They had forged close ties to the Lebanese political establishment and law enforcement community, generating an atmosphere of generalized corruption that gained Kouari the nickname of the Untouchable. Kouari's ties soon expanded overseas. It's weird, generating an atmosphere of generalized corruption that gained Kouari the nickname of the Untouchable. Corruption is something that is not sustainable. It just is not, because it is corruption. It is built on something that is based on fear, on looking away, on betraying oneself. When I'm taking money for something that is not right to do, I'm betraying my own very self, my own values, my own everything. So I'm actually the opposite of untouchable. I'm untouchable when I just would say, you know what, fuck you, Mr. Curie, and your shit that you are doing. And your whole law enforcement and all this shit, all that crap that I'm reading here. Fuck you all. The untouchable. Fuck you all. You're stupid people. And you don't even know. Okay, excuse me. I'm talking with some inner figures that are representative of Mr. Curie. Well, the untouchable. He dies anyways. What the fuck untouchable? Everyone here has to die. Nobody gets away alive. So, what untouchable? Probably he touched, more people have touched him in his fucking life than me, myself, or most other people. Curie, the untouchable. Fuck you. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Again, one of my commentaries went through the threshold of my commentary mood. All right. Curie's ties soon expanded overseas. According to a CIA report, Corsican organized crime figures allied with Curie had made inroads into the highest level of French government, industry and society, including the cabinet, police and military. Actually, we are right now probably around page 80 or something of this book. It has 500 something pages. And right now I'm already thinking, okay, so why do normal people like you and, me as well, I hope at least you are a normal person listening to this. I'm not some crazy psychopath or some Curie, the untouchable. Actually, it would be fun if this Curie would fucking listen my opinion on his untouchability and that it is a joke. Well, but however, I'm thinking I don't even have to read anymore. That when I read, crime figures allied with Curie had made inroads into the highest level of French government, industry and society, including the cabinet, police and military. So I can imagine very well that the very French water, widely distributed everywhere in Germany, called Volvic, owned by Danone, or however that is pronounced, which is some fucking water somewhere from some French, mountain in South French or somewhere, South France. Well, even they probably are working for some Maya Lansky or for some Corsican organized crime figures or for some untouchable motherfucker. So even if I would just go to the groceries and get myself a Volvic water, I would fucking support Israel or something. that's all. Well, anyhow, we will. I will work through this book. I will do this. I will make that. I will do it. But for now, I do make a pause. I'll see you in the flesh or in the next